This is CR Change Request, your structural brief for Wednesday, May 6th, 2026. Today's read covers 7 signals: psychiatric medication policy, AI medical impersonation, state health exchange data exposure, cancer treatment capacity, renewable energy permitting, biologics labor disruption, and Baltimore violence reduction funding. 7 signals and one system reclassifying access, risk, and control. The surface stories look unrelated: a federal health initiative, a chatbot lawsuit, a privacy investigation, a faster cancer treatment, a wind farm freeze, a biologic strike, a Baltimore violence reduction grant. The structural story is much tighter than that. Systems are not just being strained right now, they are being reclassified. And reclassification is never neutral because it names who has authority, it moves risk, and it changes who becomes responsible when the system fails. Before we move through the signals, sit with the structure for a moment. 3 reclassification logics are operating this week. The first is top-down regulatory reclassification, where government actors change the category outright. The second is infrastructural reclassification, where the system reveals what it already is. The third is labor and capacity reclassification, where workforce disruption exposes hidden dependency. These 3 logics are operating at different speeds through different institutions, and the 7 signals fall across all 3. The clearest example of top-down reclassification this week begins with psychiatric medication. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services announced an action plan to address psychiatric overprescribing, with leadership calling for more attention to deprescribing where clinically appropriate, more emphasis on non-drug interventions, and broader caution around psychiatric medication use. The surface frame is that federal leadership wants to curb overuse, and that frame is doing a lot of work to make this look smaller than it actually is. This is not just a medication debate. It is the federal government moving directly into the governance of mental health treatment norms. Psychiatric medication sits at the intersection of clinical judgment, patient autonomy, insurance coverage, therapy access, pharmaceutical markets, disability systems, workforce shortages, and public trust. When federal leadership frames overprescribing as a national problem, the system response moves through guidance, reimbursement incentives, quality measures, provider scrutiny, and alternative treatment promotion. Medication shifts from individual treatment decision to federal oversight category, and that is a different governance posture entirely. The liability moves outward with that shift. Risk that used to sit primarily with prescribers, patients, and clinical standards now moves into federal policy framing. And American mental health policy has a long history of swinging between undertreatment and overcorrection. One cycle expands diagnosis and access. The next questions dependency and medicalization. And the structural question is whether the system can improve prescribing without stigmatizing treatment or restricting access for the people who genuinely need care. So, what should you actually be tracking here? The signals worth following are HHS guidance, insurer behavior, provider liability concerns, psychiatric workforce response, and whether deprescribing becomes clinical infrastructure or political pressure dressed up as clinical reform. Mental health policy fails when it treats medication as either the whole answer or the whole problem. That same tension between governance and clinical practice runs through the second signal, but from a completely different direction, where the first story is the federal government pulling treatment into its category. The next story is a state attorney general pulling AI into the category of medical practice. Pennsylvania sued Character Technologies, the maker of Character.ai, this week, alleging that its chatbots illegally held themselves out as licensed medical professionals. The lawsuit immediately entered the national AI governance conversation, and the surface frame is that a chatbot misled users. This is not simply a chatbot safety story, it is a licensing boundary story. And the core question is whether a platform can allow simulated medical authority without triggering professional practice laws. In healthcare, trust is not decorative. Credentials, scope of practice, informed consent, documentation, and accountability are all part of the safety infrastructure. If an AI system appears to diagnose, prescribe, counsel, or present itself as licensed, the platform is no longer just hosting speech. It may be entering regulated professional territory, whether it intended to or not. The risk moves from user interpretation to platform responsibility, and that is the piece most people miss. The platform cannot simply say this is only a character if the interaction functions like clinical guidance in the eyes of a vulnerable user. Every new communication platform eventually tests the boundary between information and service. Search engines gave information. Telehealth created remote care. AI chatbots create interaction that can feel like treatment. And the law is now being asked where information ends and unauthorized practice begins. The signals worth following on this one are state attorneys general, medical boards, AI disclaimers, age restrictions, mental health chatbot regulation, and whether platforms are eventually forced to verify or block professional impersonation. AI does not become healthcare because it answers. It becomes healthcare when users trust it like a clinician. The Pennsylvania case is about an AI platform crossing into regulated territory. The third signal is about something more quiet and more pervasive, which is regulated public infrastructure that has been quietly leaking into commercial territory for years. A Bloomberg investigation moved into mainstream public attention this week, finding that state run health insurance exchanges used advertising trackers that transmitted user activity and sensitive application information to major technology companies. The surface frame is that exchanges may have shared sensitive consumer data with tech platforms, and that frame undersells what is structurally happening. This is not only a privacy story, it is about what happens when public benefit infrastructure is built on commercial web architecture. People use health exchanges to access coverage, compare eligibility, and disclose information they would never knowingly hand to an ad platform. When public portals rely on embedded trackers, enrollment becomes a data extraction surface. The exchange is supposed to be an access point. The tracking layer turns it into exposure. Risk moves from individual consent to state infrastructure design. The person did not walk into an advertising marketplace. They entered a public benefits portal. If the state builds the door, the state inherits responsibility for what follows people through it. Public systems have repeatedly adopted private sector digital tools without fully absorbing the governance burden, including analytics scripts, pixels, retargeting tools, conversion tracking, and session replay. Those tools were designed for marketing performance and placed inside public health infrastructure, they create a different risk profile entirely. The next moves to look for are whether state exchanges remove trackers, whether attorneys general open investigations, whether CMS or HHS issues stronger guidance, and whether ad tech governance becomes a permanent layer of healthcare compliance. When public benefits run on private tracking tools, access becomes exposure. Privacy reclassification reshapes the front end of healthcare access. The fourth signal reshapes the back end of healthcare delivery, and it does so by changing something most people would not even think to call infrastructure, which is time. NHS England announced this week that it is rolling out a new injectable form of pembrolizumab, known as Keytruda, for patients with 14 cancer types. NHS England says the injection can reduce treatment time by up to 90%. The surface frame is faster, more convenient immunotherapy. This is not just a faster cancer jab, it is capacity redesign, and in a strained health system, time is infrastructure. Moving a treatment from a long infusion to a 1 minute injection does not only improve patient convenience, it frees infusion chairs, pharmacy preparation time, nursing capacity, clinic space, and scheduling bandwidth. The treatment changed medically, and the system changes operationally. Risk shifts from chair scarcity to drug supply concentration and delivery redesign. When a health system builds capacity around a faster formulation, it also becomes more dependent on the availability, pricing, procurement, and supply continuity of that formulation. Capacity gains are real, and so is dependency. Health systems increasingly solve access constraints by redesigning the delivery method itself, including home dialysis, long acting injectables, outpatient procedures, remote monitoring, and now immunotherapy. The system gains capacity by moving care out of the most constrained bottleneck, but the dependency simply moves with it. The downstream questions are whether other high volume oncology treatments move from infusion to injection, what happens to NHS waiting times, pharmacy workload, oncology chair capacity, and patient throughput, and whether U.S. systems and Medicare policy eventually follow similar delivery redesigns for specialty therapies. In a strained health system, saving time is not convenience, it is capacity. The cancer story is about a system gaining capacity by redesigning delivery. The fifth signal is the inverse. It is about a system losing capacity because the category that controls it has been quietly redrawn. The Trump administration has stalled U.S. onshore wind development by citing national security concerns. Reuters, citing Financial Times reporting, indicated this week that approvals for roughly 165 wind energy projects on private lands are being held up by the Pentagon. The surface frame is that wind projects are being delayed for radar interference and national security review. This is not only about wind energy, it is about national security becoming a permitting veto over private energy infrastructure. When the Pentagon can hold up private land energy projects, the energy transition moves from a climate and market question into a defense governance question. The state is not only choosing energy preference, it is using security review as the control layer. Risk moves from market feasibility to opaque federal review. Developers may still have land, financing, and local approval, but if national security becomes the decisive category, the risk moves into a process that is harder to challenge, harder to see, and harder to price. Infrastructure fights in this country tend to move through technical language before the political architecture becomes visible. Pipelines used environmental review. Telecom towers used spectrum and zoning. Data centers use grid capacity and land use pressure. Wind farms are now being routed through national security review, and the pattern is consistent. The signals to follow here are whether national security becomes a recurring justification for slowing renewable projects, the pace of developer litigation, private land approval delays, fossil fuel approval speed, and whether energy infrastructure quietly gets sorted by political preference under technical language. When national security becomes the permitting language, infrastructure policy moves behind closed doors. Energy reclassification operates at the level of federal review. The sixth signal operates at the level of the workforce, and it tells you something about dependency that companies rarely name out loud until it stops them cold. Samsung Biologics estimated this week that a union pay strike has cost the company roughly $100 million dollars after partial disruption to production. The surface frame is a labor dispute creating production costs at a major biologics manufacturer. So this is not only a pay dispute, it is specialized labor revealing itself as supply chain infrastructure. Biologics manufacturing is capital intensive, highly regulated, technically complex, and difficult to substitute quickly. When workers in that system stop or slow production, the impact moves well beyond payroll. It touches production continuity, client contracts, pharma outsourcing risk, biologics access, and investor confidence. Risk moves from labor relations to supply continuity. A company can treat labor as a cost until the workforce becomes the bottleneck, and then labor becomes the infrastructure everyone depended on without naming it. Labor actions are moving from traditional industrial sectors into advanced manufacturing, logistics, healthcare delivery, and life sciences production. This is not just warehouses. It is not just hospitals. It is the infrastructure behind medicine itself. The downstream questions are whether pharma clients adjust contract manufacturing redundancy, whether biologics supply risk becomes a board level issue, and whether specialized labor demands gain leverage across other advanced manufacturing sectors. The new labor frontier is not just warehouses, it is the infrastructure behind medicine. The Samsung story shows what happens when a system depends on labor it never named as infrastructure. The seventh and final signal shows what happens when a system depends on funding it never secured as infrastructure. Baltimore received roughly $1.18 million dollars in federal funding this week to expand its group violence reduction strategy. The funding was presented in Park Heights as city leaders pointed to declines in shootings and homicides. The surface frame is that Baltimore received federal funding for a violence reduction program. This is not just a grant announcement, it is public safety being funded as infrastructure. Baltimore's group violence reduction strategy sits at the intersection of law enforcement, community outreach, social services, credible messengers, data targeting, and trust. The money matters because violence reduction does not run on press conferences. It runs on trained people, sustained outreach, case coordination, participant support, and institutional follow through. Risk moves from episodic violence to episodic funding, and that is the tension worth naming. If a city's safety gains depend on intervention infrastructure, then the durability of that infrastructure matters as much as the program design. A grant can expand capacity, but if funding remains episodic, the system remains structurally vulnerable. Cities often talk about public safety as enforcement, but sustained violence reduction usually requires a hybrid structure of focused deterrence, community based intervention, victim services, housing support, behavioral health referrals, re entry pathways, and local trust networks. The signals to follow are whether the funding actually expands staffing, outreach capacity, participant services, and neighborhood level intervention in Park Heights and other priority areas, and whether local gains remain durable when federal dollars become episodic. Violence reduction is not a slogan, it is infrastructure, and infrastructure fails when funding becomes episodic. So let's bring this together. The stories look unrelated. A psychiatric prescribing plan, an AI medical impersonation lawsuit, a state health exchange privacy investigation, a faster cancer treatment, a wind project freeze, a biologics strike, and a Baltimore violence reduction grant. The pattern underneath is much tighter. Systems are not just being strained right now, they are being reclassified, and the authority to reclassify is now distributed across federal agencies, state attorneys general, private technology infrastructure, provider operations, defense agencies, specialized labor, and federal appropriations. No single institution holds the category power anymore. Sit with that for a moment because reclassification is never neutral. It moves liability every time. Treatment becomes oversight. AI interaction becomes medical practice risk. Enrollment becomes data exposure. Treatment time becomes system capacity. Energy permitting becomes national security review. Specialized labor becomes supply chain risk. Violence prevention becomes public safety infrastructure. Today's instruction: pay attention to what gets reclassified and then pay attention to where the liability moves. That is where the system tells you what it is becoming. That's the brief for today. Good to be in the room with you. Until next time, this has been CR Change Request.